We are just past the halfway point of this study, so it's a good time for us to reorient ourselves. The surest way to get where you're going is to know where you were when you started, to know where you are at any given point in time, and to keep your eyes fixed on the destination. The point of us studying the basics is to help us understand the key and foundational elements of the Christian faith and worldview, the way of looking at the world, so that we can better understand where we have come from, why we are here, what we're supposed to do while we're here, and where we're headed. The answers to these questions from a Christian perspective can be found in the story arc of the Bible, the book that God has given us to tell us about himself, who he is, and what he's doing. The Bible is a compilation of many different books that are written by many different authors across a vast span of time and place, and yet it is remarkably unified in telling the story of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, or recreation. The starting point is the God who made everything and who made it all good. And we can clearly see the goodness, the excellence of God all over his creation. We see it in nature, in the power of the Rocky Mountains, the beauty of the Aurora Borealis, and in the vastness of the ocean. As the apex of his creation, humanity also was created with excellence, in splendor, and we were created to love and to worship and to serve our God. And when we look at humanity, we can see amazing wonder. We can see diversity, complexity, love and tenderness in relationship, strength in community, selfless sacrifice. We see the imprint of God. Many years ago, I was watching the Oprah show, and her guest was talking about the beauty of nature. And she was speaking about how she would observe birds, how they would fly, and they would all flock together, and they would dip and soar in this choreographed unison, connected by some unseen bond. And she said that she believed as humans became increasingly enlightened, we would begin to become increasingly more like the animal kingdom and live in this kind of harmony and unity. What a picture, right? You can almost hear John Lennon singing Imagine in the background. And it's a beautiful picture, but we do have to ask ourselves, is this what we see in reality? A couple of years ago, this bird, it built its nest near our dining room window. We could see it while we ate our supper. So we would watch Mama Bird work away while we ate our supper, and she built the nest, she settled into it, and eventually she laid some eggs. And so we look forward to the day that we could enjoy the fruits of her labor and see the little baby birds. Except that day actually never came, because one day while we were eating our supper, this bigger, stronger, meaner bird came and it attacked the mama bird. And we tried to intervene. We tried to scare this big bully bird away, but it ignored us. And I ended up crying. I ended up blaming Rob because somehow it was his fault that he hadn't been able to scare, the big bird away and save the mother bird and her nest. The kids were probably traumatized. Supper was definitely ruined. And John Lennon was not singing in the background of this situation. So why is there such a strong disconnect between the beauty of the created order as we read about it and as we see glimpses of it, but then this reality that is less glorious that we see lived out around us? Why do we see nature behaving in ways like those birds outside our dining room window? How do I explain my dog Charlie, who, he can be really, really sweet, but he can also be really naughty. This is a picture of him just moments after stealing our neighbor's Thanksgiving turkey on Thanksgiving morning. How do I explain him? How do I explain my kids and the fact that, they've been raised reasonably well, but I still have to constantly remind them about what is appropriate behavior and what isn't? How do I explain myself? I know that I was raised very well, and I still do things that surprise me, that profoundly disappoint and sadden me. What happened? There is a prevailing sentiment that all humanity needs is to be educated and enlightened, and then they will evolve and be connected and united in love and understanding. And while it's admirable, it's only a sentiment. Reality tells a different story. The 20th century is an age of unmatched progress, and yet it is also the bloodiest century in recorded history. Even if we don't consider the two world wars, which killed an unprecedented number of people, there remains the genocide in Rwanda, the killing fields of Cambodia, the horrific bloodbaths that have occurred in China at the hands of the Japanese and then again at the hands of communist dictator Mao Zedong. There is the communist revolutions in the Soviet Union. There's what happened with the dissolution of Yugoslavia. I mean, I could keep going on and on. We may want to believe the narrative that all people need is education and enlightenment to live in peace and harmony, but reality doesn't bear that out. What was created in beauty and excellence has been marred and fractured due to the fall. The Bible doesn't skip from Genesis 2 to Revelation 21. It goes from Genesis 2, where Adam and Eve were standing before each other and before God, naked and unashamed, to Genesis 3, this terrible story of a serpent entering God's beautiful garden and bringing with it evil. Well, that is a surprise, we think, when we get to chapter 3, because where did this terrible snake come from? Where did evil come from? If it exists and we're saying that God created everything, did God create evil? And I mean, how could that possibly be if God is entirely good? So does it mean that God isn't entirely good? These are questions that we have to face if we're going to answer Genesis 3. And we are somewhat conditioned in our place and time to see good and evil as these competing powers, to understand the world dualistically, so the light side versus the dark side. And this is the storyline of Star Wars, but it isn't the storyline of the Bible. Good and evil are not competing powers. God is good, entirely and completely. Evil is not a competing power. It is simply ungodliness, unrighteousness. It's turning away from the good that is defined by God, and therefore it's a turning away from God. All that is needed for evil to exist is for created beings who have the freedom of choice, the freedom to choose to keep God in his rightful place and to honor and obey him as God, or to choose to reject his position and his authority and therefore reject him. We've looked at the doctrine of creation, we've looked at the doctrine of authority and judgment, and now we need to understand the doctrine of sin. Adam and Eve in the garden did not accidentally stumble into sin. They did not make an uninformed, hasty, or spontaneous choice without really knowing better. They didn't reach for a good end and unintentionally live out a less than perfect means to that end. Adam and Eve sinned deliberately, intentionally, and knowingly. We have continued to do the same since then. Like them, we have mistrusted God and his instructions. We've rebelled against them and we've rebelled against him. In our homework this week, we read Genesis 3 and we saw this serpent tempting Eve to stand in judgment of God and his rules. He invites her to question whether God can really be trusted. He calls into question the doctrine of judgment. He says, will you really die if you disobey God? Eve is being tempted towards autonomy, and the whole while her husband stands by and says nothing. The one who was given the instruction to protect and to keep the garden and the rule of the king in the garden, the one who was supposed to share this instruction with his wife and to protect her and to defend her, he's silent. He doesn't intervene, and worse yet, he ends up joining her and listening to the creature rather than to the creator. As we read, we see Eve follow her feelings, her impressions, rather than her instructions. She sees the fruit and it looks good, it looks delightful, it looks desirable. And so she doesn't ask what is true. Instead, she asks, what is palatable? What do I want? We are often tempted to make the mistake of holding our actions, our motives and intentions up against other people or against situations. And so we might be tempted to excuse Adam and Eve by saying, what's the big deal? It's just a piece of fruit, right? What's the big deal? It's just a white lie. It's just fill in the blanks. And the problem with that is sin isn't measured against us, and it isn't measured by our standards. It's measured against God and by his standard. Any and all sin is treating God as less than what he is, Creator God of the universe, who is himself the standard. All sin is against him. That's why in Psalm 51, David is able to write, against you and you only have I sinned. And if we know the context that he's writing this, we're like, nope. You took a woman who was not yours to take, and then you lied about it, and you tried to cover it up by killing her husband. I would say you sinned against a whole lot of people. And yes, he did. That's true. But ultimately, his sin was an act of rebellion against God. Our response to the knowledge of God as good and loving and a generous creator, it should be awe. It should be gratitude. It should be a delight to serve him, and instead we rebel. And then we're tempted to see our rebellion against the high King of heaven as harmless, maybe even pretty, desirable. We excuse it. We attempt to redefine it. We raise our fists against the one who stands behind the standard, and we say that the problem is with him, not with us. When we start with creation and we see the beauty and the excellence of it, the magnificence of a God who stamped visions of who he is all over what he created, who dwelled among his creation and lived in a relationship of unparalleled intimacy with it, we can better understand the horror of the fall. When we see the fall held up against creation, we see, as John Calvin said, the spectacle of our foulness, the miserable ruin that we have become. We see how we, on our own, are completely unable to fulfill the purpose for which we were created, because death does indeed come when we take and eat what we should not. There's this show that my family, we loved watching together about a year ago, and it's called Orangutan Jungle School. And it's filmed in Thailand at a place where young orangutans who have been rescued from, poaching or deforestation or the like, and are taken to the school and trained as to how to live in the wild once again. To survive in the wild again, the orangutans need to have a right fear of danger. And one of the dangers that exists for them is snakes. And so to teach them to have a right fear of snakes, the trainers took the orangutans out to their jungle playground. And then while the orangutans were having fun and playing, the head trainer released a fake snake. And immediately all the other trainers ran from that snake, screaming their heads off. They were modeling for the orangutans how they were supposed to behave in the face of this danger. They were modeling an important truth. A snake is dangerous. Be scared. Run from it. And two of the orangutans, they're best friends, and they don't go anywhere without their arms wrapped around each other. And so they were running away from this snake with their arms wrapped around each other. And because they wouldn't let go of each other, they were too slow to be safe. And I thought, man, if this was like a real life snake, a real life situation, this wouldn't be cute. This would be scary, because, like the show's narrator spelled out, if these orangutans don't learn to run from danger, they will die. But the lesson wasn't over yet. The other trainers were running and screaming away from this fake snake, but the head trainer went and got a club. And he showed the older orangutans what to do. He took his club and he beat that snake to death. He killed it. He crushed it. We must never face danger by standing by complacently as it slithers in. We need to identify it as dangerous, and we need to run for our lives. But in the face of a danger that we are unable to defeat, we have a safe place to run. Our Savior has defeated the serpent. He crushed it with the cross. And we who are not just empty of good, but full of evil, we need a Redeemer. We have one in Jesus Christ who said, "Take and eat." And then he offered us his own body. This is our God. May we earnestly seek him.